Tonight we begin not in the comfort of a modern kitchen, but under a vast, indifferent New Mexico sky, the air thick with the scent of dust and wood smoke. You are not a passive observer here. You are standing at the edge of a makeshift camp, the ground hard beneath your feet. Your eyes are drawn to a simple, crackling fire, where a woman works with a quiet, focused intensity. In her hands is a simple dough, and in a cast-iron skillet shimmering with precious, hot fat, a transformation is beginning. You watch as a pale disk of dough meets the oil, and instantly, it comes alive, bubbling, hissing, turning a triumphant, golden brown. This is the birth of a symbol, forged not from tradition, but from absolute necessity. This is fry bread, and its creation story is one of survival, a culinary act of defiance against a landscape designed for starvation. Frankly, listening to its story might just give you a craving so profound you'll be tempted to try making it yourself at 2 a.m. And let's be honest, navigating a vat of bubbling oil while half asleep is a gamble you probably won't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the weight of the year 1864 settle around you, a heavy, tangible thing. The story of this bread doesn't start with a celebration, but with an ending. 4 generations, the Dine, the people, had lived in a vast, beautiful homeland they called Dineta, a land of red mesas, deep canyons, and resilient crops. Theirs was a cuisine built on the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, foods that grew in harmony with the dry earth and sustained a complex, sophisticated culture. You can almost feel the texture of blue cornmeal between your fingers, smell the earthy scent of simmering beans. This was a world of balance. Historians widely agree that the agricultural practices of the Dine and other southwestern tribes were remarkably advanced, adapting to an arid climate long before the concept of sustainable farming existed. But that world was about to be shattered. The US government, pursuing a brutal policy of removal, issued an ultimatum: leave or be killed. The result was the Long Walk, a forced exodus of over 8,000 Navajo men, women, and children from their sacred lands in what is now Arizona to a desolate, unfamiliar reservation over 300 miles to the east, called Bosque Redondo, or Huildi, the place of suffering. It was a death march. People died from exhaustion, exposure, and despair, their connection to their land severed with every painful step. You walk with them now, the gritty dust coating your throat, the sun a merciless eye overhead. The destination, when you finally reach it, is a cruel joke. Bosque Redondo was a flat, barren plain in eastern New Mexico, where the water was alkaline and the soil refused to nurture the traditional seeds they had carried with them. The government's plan had failed before it began. This was land that could not support life as they knew it. And here, in this place of hunger and hopelessness, the US government offered its solution: rations. These were the ingredients of survival, and they were profoundly alien. Sacks of white wheat flour, bricks of hard lard, small amounts of salt, sugar, and baking powder. These were the tools of a foreign cuisine, the foods of the conqueror. To the Dine, used to the whole, earthy grains of corn, this fine, pale flour must have seemed sterile, devoid of spirit. The lard, rendered from animals they did not raise, was a poor substitute for the natural fats they knew. This is the bleak, undeniable historical fact upon which our entire story rests. Fry bread was born from US government rations issued during the incarceration of the Navajo people at Bosque Redondo. It was not a choice, but a desperate adaptation. A lesser-known, almost heartbreaking detail is that among these rations was often coffee, not as a beverage, but as a commodity to be traded. Some families would hoard their coffee beans, not for drinking, but to trade with passing Comancheros for bits of cloth, metal, or, if they were lucky, different food. Imagine that, a symbol of waking up, transformed into a currency for mere existence. And yet, in the face of this cultural obliteration, the women began to work. With hands that once ground corn on a metate, they now sifted strange white flour. They mixed it with the salty water of the Pecos River and the rendered lard, creating a simple dough. There were no measurements passed down through generations, no grandmother's whispered secrets. There was only trial, error, and the relentless need to fill empty bellies. You watch as one woman, her face etched with weariness, pinches off a piece of dough. She doesn't have a rolling pin, so she uses her hands, stretching and patting the dough into a thin disc. She makes a few small slits in the center, a practical trick learned quickly to keep the bread from puffing up like a hollow balloon in the hot fat. Then, she lowers it carefully into a skillet of precious, popping lard. The sound it makes is not like anything from the old life. It's a fierce, lively sizzle, a sound the Navajo would later give a name to. They call it Ba Da Gaus. Ba means bread, and Da Gaus poetically describes that very sound, the bread that bubbles and fries. Listen for it. That's the sound of creation under duress. As the dough hits the oil, it doesn't just cook, it reacts. It bubbles and blisters, turning from a pale, lifeless white to a vibrant, golden brown. The smell that rises is one of simple, fatty, comforting carbohydrates, a smell of sheer sustenance. When she lifts it out, letting the excess oil drip away, she isn't holding a delicacy. She's holding a lifeline. It's dense, it's filling, and it can be made from the meager, monotonous rations that defined their captivity. This act of frying was more than cooking. It was a small, daily reclamation of agency. In a place where they controlled nothing, not their movement, not their food, not their future, they controlled the heat, the timing, the transformation of these foreign ingredients into something that could sustain their families. The journey of that simple dough did not end at the edge of the skillet, nor did its purpose stop at merely quieting hunger. As you stand in that Bosque Redondo camp, watching the rhythm of its making become ingrained, you start to see its role evolve. The bread that bubbled and fried, Ba Da Gaus, began to weave itself into the very fabric of daily survival in this barren place. It became a plate, a spoon, a bowl, a versatile vessel for whatever scant nourishment could be found. You see a child, their fingers carefully tearing a piece of warm fry bread, using it to scoop up the last bits of a thin, government-issued stew made from tough beef and bitter river water. The bread soaks up the broth, transforming a meager liquid into a substantive bite. It's a practical innovation born of necessity. When you have no traditional pottery that survived the long walk, and no means to make more, your food becomes your utensil. This adaptability is the first sign that fry bread was becoming more than a ration recipe. It was becoming a foundational medium. But its significance deepened further, moving from the physical to the social. In a place designed to break communal bonds and isolate individuals, the process of making fry bread stubbornly resisted. It could not be made efficiently for one. It was, by its very nature, a communal act. You hear the low murmur of conversation restarting, not as it once was, but hesitantly, around the cooking fires. The gathering of flour, the heating of the shared lard, the watching of the skillet. These actions created a new, fragile center. Elders who felt their knowledge of the old ways had become useless found a role in supervising the fire's heat. Young girls, whose futures seemed to have vanished, learned the precise wrist flick needed to stretch the dough without tearing it. The rhythmic patting of dough became a quiet, shared heartbeat for the community. A widely accepted historical fact is that the social structures of many tribes were severely damaged by the reservation system and federal policies aimed at assimilation. Yet, in these small, smoke-filled circles, a new kind of social glue was being concocted, literally from flour and fat. Here lies a surprising, poignant detail about those early days. The government rations were not only poor in quality but were also often intentionally insufficient or late, a tool of control. When the food shipments were delayed, the memory of that fry bread, and the ability to make it from even the smallest hoarded stash, became a psychological lifeline. It represented a tiny margin of control over the threat of starvation. Some oral histories even suggest that the distinctive practice of poking a hole in the center of the dough before frying, which many say is to let the steam escape and cook it evenly, also served a symbolic purpose for some. It was a window, a way to see through the hardship, a small act of defining the substance rather than letting it be an impenetrable mass. Whether true in intent or not, it speaks to the human need to imprint meaning onto the tools of survival. And as the months at Wheeldee bled into years, a subtle culinary fingerprint began to form. There was no single, official recipe handed down from an authority. Instead, 1,000 tiny variations bloomed from family circle to family circle, each a quiet signature. One cook might find that a pinch more salt made the bland flour taste of something. Another, perhaps trading a precious coffee ration, might acquire a little sugar to add a hint of sweetness to the dough for the children. The consistency varied. Some preferred it thin and crispy, able to snap like a cracker. Others patted it thick and pillowy, a more substantial cushion against hunger. This was the beginning of what we might now call family recipes, but they were born not from tradition, but from isolation and tiny, hard-won experiments with monotony. Historians still argue whether the rapid adoption and variation of fry bread among the Navajo represents a tragic loss of food sovereignty or the astonishing speed of cultural adaptation under extreme pressure. Was it a sign that the government's plan to remake them was working, or proof that their identity could not be erased, only forced to express itself in a new, resilient form? You watch as a woman tastes a piece from her sister's skillet, nodding thoughtfully. No words are exchanged about the texture or flavor, but a knowledge is passed. In this silent exchange, a new, unspoken tradition is being ratified. The bread was no longer just a product of the ingredients. It was becoming a product of the people, a simple food that carried the weight of their shared circumstance and their individual attempts to make it bearable. It was the taste of here and now, a far cry from the then and there of the lost homeland, but it was, unmistakably, theirs. You feel the air change, not in temperature, but in spirit. The year is 1868, and a fragile hope, thin as parchment, is carried on the wind across Bosque Redondo. After 4 years of suffering, death, and failed agricultural experiments that left the land scarred and the people broken, the U.S. government finally admitted its catastrophic mistake. The Treaty of 1868 was signed. It was not a restoration, but a negotiation. The Navajo would be allowed to return to a portion of their ancestral lands, a reservation that was a mere fraction of Dainita. In return, they agreed to cease resistance and to send their children to government schools. It was a painful bargain, but it contained the precious promise of going home. The exodus from Wheeldee began, a reverse long walk, this one fueled not by despair, but by a weary, determined hope. And packed among the few belongings, carried not in sacks but in memory, was the knowledge of how to make fry bread. The journey back was its own kind of trial. The landscape they crossed was familiar yet altered, a ghost of its former self. And when they finally reached the designated reservation lands, the reality of their return settled upon them. This was not the home they remembered. Their orchards were gone, their fields overgrown, their sacred places now outside the new, imposed borders. They had to rebuild everything from nothing. And in this new beginning, the ingredients that once symbolized captivity took on a different meaning. The government, as part of the treaty obligations, continued for a time to issue rations, the same white flour, lard, salt, and baking powder. But now, These ingredients were no longer just the tools of survival in a prison camp. They became the scarce building blocks for a new life on their own, wounded land. Frybread made the transition with them. It was a food of displacement that now had to nourish a people rerouting themselves. This is where a lesser-known, deeply practical chapter of the story unfolds. The traditional hogan, the Navajo home, is a sacred, circular structure with a door facing east to welcome the sunrise. Rebuilding these hogans was a spiritual and physical priority. And the cooking fire moved from an open pit in the center to a more contained, often outdoor, kitchen space. The skillet for making fry bread, usually a heavy cast iron pan, became one of the most vital and durable possessions a family could own. It was a modern tool for an unchanging need, to feed a family with what you have. You see a woman setting her skillet over a fire outside her newly built hogan. The action is the same, the stretching of the dough, the sizzle in the hot fat, but the context has fundamentally shifted. She is no longer a prisoner cooking under guard. She is a sovereign person cooking for her family on her own land, however reduced that land may be. The smoke from her fire now rises into her sky. The act itself became a quiet, daily reassertion of autonomy. Historians widely accept that the late 19th century was a period of intense cultural pressure on the Navajo, from forced livestock reduction to the trauma of boarding schools that sought to kill the Indian, save the man. Yet, in the hogan's shadow, the making of fry bread persisted as an unbroken, woman-centered practice, a culinary thread that connected the pain of Wheeldee to the struggle of the present. The bread also began to anchor new celebrations. Life on the reservation was harsh, but moments of joy and community were reclaimed. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Navajo, like many tribes, have a complex calendar of ceremonies and gatherings. As these cultural practices were cautiously revived, fry bread found its place there, too. It was not a ceremonial food in the ancient sense. It had no place in the old stories or blessings. But it became the social food, the generous, shareable sustenance for gatherings after a squaw dance, a puberty ceremony, or a community meeting. Its very abundance when made in large batches made it perfect for feeding a crowd. Its appealing, comforting aroma and taste made it a welcome gift. It was incorporated not because it was traditional, but because it was there, reliable, and loved. It became traditional through use. And here, we stumble upon a slightly amusing, humanizing detail from this era of adaptation. With government-issued baking powder now a standard ingredient, the bread became consistently puffier and softer than those earliest, denser survival discs. This led to its own minor evolution, the Navajo taco. While the fuller loaded version with chili, cheese, lettuce, and tomato is a later 20th century innovation, the concept of using fry bread as a base for other foods has deep roots. Oral histories suggest that as families slowly rebuilt flocks and herds, mutton stew became a prized dish. A piece of fry bread laid in a bowl, stew spooned over it, was a logical, delicious, and efficient way to eat. It was a taco in spirit, if not yet in name. This showcases the food's ongoing adaptability. It was a plate, a utensil, and now, a foundational component of a more complex meal. Historians still argue whether the incorporation of fry bread into social and quasi-ceremonial settings represents the final stage of its assimilation into Navajo identity, or if it demonstrates the Navajo genius for syncretism, for taking something external and weaving it so thoroughly into the cultural fabric that it becomes authentically theirs. As you watch the woman outside her hogan slide a perfect golden circle onto a plate, you realize the question may be irrelevant to her. The bread is hot. Her family is hungry. It is food, it is memory, and it is, for this moment, enough. The recipe, born in trauma, was now being written into the chapter of return. Time moves forward, and the setting shifts again. The stark, open landscape around the hogan begins to hum with a new, intrusive energy. The early 20th century arrives, and with it, the outside world starts to press in on the reservation borders with a more persistent curiosity. First come the traders, operating out of remote posts like Ganadu or Hubbles, places that become economic lifelines and cultural crossroads. Then, slowly, come the anthropologists, the photographers, the tourists seeking the authentic West. And in this new exchange, part economic, part cultural, part exploitation, Frybread steps onto a different kind of stage. It is no longer a purely private, communal food. It becomes an artifact, a symbol, and eventually, a commodity. You're standing now by the rough-hewn counter of a trading post, the air thick with the smells of leather, coffee, and wool. The Navajo people, now deeply connected to a cash economy through their famed rug weaving and silverwork, come to trade. And sometimes, what they bring isn't just a rug or a bracelet. A woman might bring a bundle of fry bread, wrapped in cloth, to trade for a bag of sugar, some yeast, or brightly colored thread. The trader, a non-native man who likely knows little of the bread's painful origin, tastes it. It's delicious, filling, and novel. He might offer a few cents for it, or suggest she make some for his own family. In this simple transaction, Frybread makes its first, tentative journey into the non-native world. It is judged not as a historical document, but as a consumable. Its value shifts from purely nutritional and social to also include economic and aesthetic. This era also sees the beginnings of its mythologization. Writers and early visitors to the Southwest, enamored with the romance of Indian life, often described native foods. Fry bread, golden and picturesque, fit perfectly into their narratives. It was described in magazines and travelogues as a traditional Indian bread, its recent, traumatic genesis conveniently blurred or entirely omitted. A widely accepted historical fact is that the Santa Fe Railroad and the Harvey Company actively promoted tourism to the Southwest in the early 1900s, often staging Indian scenes and selling authentic Indian crafts. While fry bread wasn't likely on the Harvey House menu, this commercial packaging of native culture created a context where a food like it could be easily slotted into the outside world's imagination as an ancient, romantic tradition. The painful truth of Bosque Redondo was not a good selling point, a timeless tribal recipe was. And here's a surprising, somewhat ironic twist from this period. As fry bread began to be seen by outsiders as a quintessential Indian food, it actually started to spread among different tribes. The government's ration policies were not unique to the Navajo. Many Plains and southwestern tribes received similar shipments of flour, lard, and baking powder during their own periods of displacement and reservation life. Through intertribal gatherings, rodeos, and later, pan-Indian events, people from different nations tasted each other's variations. The Lakota might make it a little thicker, the Hopi a little thinner. Recipes were exchanged, compared, and debated. Fry bread, a food born from a shared experience of federal policy, became a rare, common culinary tongue in a landscape of incredibly diverse indigenous foodways. It became, for better or worse, a pan-Indian symbol. Historians still argue whether this spread represents a unifying thread of shared colonial experience or the unfortunate homogenization of diverse indigenous cuisines under the blunt instrument of federal policy. Was it a symbol of solidarity, or a reminder of a common wound? Back on the reservation, however, the recipe continued its quiet, domestic evolution. The introduction of commercially produced cooking oils like Crisco, which became widely available in the mid-20th century, was a minor revolution. Lard was still used, but vegetable shortening offered a new option. Some said it made the bread lighter and less greasy. Cast iron skillets were supplemented by deep pots, allowing the bread to be fully submerged, creating a puffier, more uniform shape. The recipe, which had never been rigid, absorbed these new tools without fuss. A lesser-known detail is that this period also saw the informal standardization of the classic recipe in many households: flour, salt, baking powder, water, and fat for frying. It was a list that would have been recognizable to that first woman at Bosque Redondo, yet the results were now consistently predictable. The survival food was becoming a comfort food, its edges softened by time and incremental tweaks. So, as you watch that trader take a bite of the bread, nodding in approval, you witness a pivotal moment. The circle of fry bread is passing from an internal, meaning-laden object to an external, simplified symbol. Its journey from a skillet over a prison campfire to a potential item of commerce and curiosity is almost complete. It carries the weight of its history silently, while presenting a friendly, golden, deceptively simple face to the world. The outside world was beginning to taste it, but it would be decades before it even began to comprehend the story it was eating. The mid-20th century brings a new kind of migration, and fry bread is packed for the journey. This time, it's not a forced march, but the complex, often painful relocation of native people from reservations to urban centers like Los Angeles, Denver, and Chicago. Federal policies like the Indian Termination Act and the Indian Relocation Act of 1956 aimed to assimilate Native Americans by cutting tribal ties and pushing them into cities with promises of jobs and housing, promises that frequently went unfulfilled. In crowded, unfamiliar apartments far from the open sky of the reservation, a profound loneliness set in. And in this new urban isolation, the making of fry bread became an act of profound cultural preservation. You're in a small, linoleum-tiled kitchen in a Los Angeles apartment building. The sounds are not of wind and coyotes, but of traffic and distant sirens. A Navajo woman, far from her mother and her grandmother's hogan, clears a space on the counter. She measures out flour, not from a government sack, but from a bag bought at the local market. The ingredients are the same, but the context is alien. As she mixes the dough, the familiar, slightly dusty smell of the flour mixes with the unfamiliar smells of the city. The act of kneading, of stretching the dough, becomes a tactile prayer, a connection to a place and a people she's physically severed from. The sizzle when the dough hits the hot oil in her modern stovetop pot is the same sound, da Daniel Gauss. But here, in this sterile kitchen, it's a defiant echo of home. She isn't just making lunch, she's conjuring a scent, a sound, a taste that can, for a moment, collapse the miles of loneliness. This is a widely acknowledged historical reality. For relocated individuals, traditional foods became critical anchors for cultural identity in a hostile, assimilative environment. The bread also became a social magnet, a creator of community in concrete jungles where none existed. Word would get out, Clara is making fry bread tonight. It wasn't an invitation sent on paper. It was a signal, understood by those who were similarly displaced. Other Navajo, perhaps even Hopi or Sioux families from the same relocation programs, would find their way to that apartment. The small kitchen would become crowded, filled with the shared language of cooking and the comfort of a familiar aroma. The fry bread, served with maybe some store-bought honey or canned chili, became the centerpiece of an impromptu, urban ceremony. It was a taste of shared memory, a lifeline back to a collective identity that government policy was actively trying to erase. In these gatherings, the recipe was shared not as a survival technique, but as a cultural heirloom, its instructions whispered like a secret that could stave off homesickness. Here's a surprising, poignant detail from this urban chapter. For the first generation of children born in the city, fry bread took on a layered meaning. To them, it wasn't directly associated with the hardship of Bosque Redondo or even the reservation life their parents described. For these kids, it was simply mom's bread, the special food that made their apartment smell different, and better, than their non-native friends' homes. It was the food that appeared when relatives visited, the treat that marked a good report card or a birthday. It became, for them, a pure symbol of family love and ethnic pride, its painful origins abstracted by a generation. This generational shift in perception is crucial. It's how a food of trauma begins its journey toward becoming a food of cherished, normalized tradition. Yet, this period also planted the seeds for a future complication: health. On the reservation, this dense, fried bread was part of a broader, often physically demanding lifestyle. In the sedentary urban environment, coupled with the increasing availability of other processed foods and sugary drinks, diets high in fry bread began to contribute to new public health crises, like dramatically rising rates of diabetes and heart disease. The food that had literally saved lives was now, in a different context, linked to a new threat. Historians and public health scholars still argue fiercely whether it is fair or productive to single out fry bread, a single food with deep cultural resonance, as a culprit in a much larger, systemic issue of poverty, changing lifestyles, and limited access to healthy food options in both urban and reservation communities. Is it a symbol of resilience, or has it become a dangerous relic? Standing in that LA kitchen, watching the woman carefully flip a perfectly golden piece of bread, you see all these threads converge. The bread in the oil is a time traveler. It holds the memory of the reservation, the pain of relocation, the love of a mother, and the gathering of a scattered community. It is a paradox, a simple circle of dough that is at once a comfort and a potential threat, a private memory and a public symbol. Its recipe remained unchanged, but the weight it carried for the person making it grew heavier and more complex with each generation that left home. The late 20th century stirs with a new energy, a political and cultural awakening. The American Indian Movement, AIM, seizes national attention with protests like the occupation of Alcatraz and Wounded Knee. Red Power graffiti appears on urban walls. In this era of defiant visibility, where Native people forcefully reclaim their narrative from decades of Hollywood stereotypes and government neglect, symbols become weapons and tools. And fry bread, perhaps unexpectedly, finds itself drafted into the cause. It moves from the private kitchens of relocation apartments to the very public front lines of cultural reclamation. Imagine yourself at a protest encampment in the 1970s, maybe on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The air is charged with chanting, the smell of smoke from a sacred fire, and determination. Amidst the signs demanding treaty rights and sovereignty, you see something else, a makeshift kitchen tent. Inside, women are making fry bread. Not for sale, but for sustenance. They are feeding the activists, the elders who have come to stand witness, the journalists who wander through. In this context, the bread performs a dual function. Practically, it feeds a hungry movement. Symbolically, it is a powerful statement. We are still here. We feed ourselves. We feed our cause with the very food born from your attempt to erase us. It is a cuisine of resistance, served hot. This public, political deployment of fry bread is a widely recognized facet of the era's activism, a way of grounding a political struggle in a tangible, cultural reality. Concurrently, a more commercial, but equally identity-driven, phenomenon begins: the Indian taco. While fry bread had long been used as a base for stews and toppings, the specific assembly of a large piece of fry bread laden with ground beef chili, shredded cheese, lettuce, tomato, onions, and salsa coalesced into a defined dish. It started at tribal fairs, powwows, and community fundraisers. The Navajo taco or Indian taco became a staple, a delicious and efficient way to feed crowds and raise money for everything from a school trip to a legal defense fund. You're at a powwow now, the drums a heartbeat in the air. The most crowded booth isn't always the one with the best dancers. It's the one with the longest line for tacos. The act of eating one becomes a sensory experience of contemporary native culture. The crisp soft bread, the savory toppings, the communal act of standing in line with people from many different nations, all there for the same thing. It was cuisine as celebration, as fundraiser, and as a proud, public declaration of a living, evolving food culture. This commercialization, however, sparked its own internal debates. As Indian tacos became popular at intertribal events, a surprising and slightly amusing point of contention arose: the toppings. Purists argued that authentic Navajo tacos should only have chili made from mutton, the traditional Navajo meat, not ground beef. Others embraced the beef as a modern adaptation. Debates simmered over the inclusion of olives, sour cream, or pinto beans versus kidney beans. These weren't just culinary disagreements. They were micro-negotiations about authenticity, adaptation, and ownership. Was the true Indian taco the one that hewed closest to reservation-specific ingredients, or was its very adaptability part of its modern, pan-tribal identity? Historians still argue whether the mass popularity of the Indian taco in the late 20th century represents the successful commodification and dilution of a cultural symbol, or its triumphant democratization and evolution into a unifying, contemporary icon. Amidst this, the recipe itself stood as an unwavering touchstone. At countless community cookbooks compiled by tribal organizations or women's groups, the frybread recipe was always included, often as the very first entry. It was presented not with fanfare about its history, but with the simple, assured tone of a fundamental truth. Grandma's frybread or auntie's frybread would list the same few ingredients: flour, baking powder, salt, water, fat. The instructions were soothingly repetitive: mix until it feels right, knead gently, let the dough rest. In these community-published pages, the recipe was canonized. It was no longer just a method. It was a shared artifact, a piece of common knowledge that bound the diaspora together. Its unchanging ingredient list became a quiet rebuttal to a world that was constantly trying to change them. While the debates about its meaning and health implications rumbled on, the act of making it, the feel of the dough, the sound of the sizzle, remained a sacred, sensory constant. In a time of loud protest and public reinvention, the quiet, private ritual of its creation provided a deep, anchoring continuity. As the 20th century wanes, a new consciousness rises, one that casts a critical, sometimes uncomfortable, light on old symbols. The very bread that had become a beloved staple, a fundraiser, and a symbol of resilience found itself at the center of a growing and painful paradox. The same medical establishment that had historically failed native communities began to publish stark data. Epidemics of type 2 diabetes, obesity, and heart disease were ravaging reservations and urban native populations alike. And in the search for dietary causes, the spotlight, inevitably, fell on frybread. That golden, comforting circle was now being labeled a dangerous tradition, a food of oppression, even a slow poison. You're in a community health clinic on the reservation now, looking at a poster that shows a cartoon piece of frybread with a red slash through it, next to images of fresh vegetables. The message is clear, and it feels like a betrayal. This created a profound internal conflict. For generations, elders had taught that this bread was a gift of survival, a symbol of a mother's love and a community's strength. Now, their grandchildren were being told by doctors and nutritionists that this same food was harming them. The emotional weight was immense. To reject frybread could feel like rejecting grandmothers, aunties, and the very acts of care that had sustained families through hardship. It felt like another assault on identity, this time dressed in the lab coat of public health. A widely accepted fact is that the prevalence of type 2 diabetes among American Indians and Alaska Natives is significantly higher than in the general U.S. population, A crisis linked to complex factors including poverty, genetic predisposition, and historical trauma. But the simplification of this crisis into a war on a single food overlooked the systemic issues. The food deserts on reservations with no access to fresh produce, the high cost of healthy food, and the legacy of poverty that made cheap, filling calories a necessity, not a choice. Within this tension, a fascinating and lesser-known movement began, the culinary reinterpretation. Instead of outright abandonment, some native chefs and home cooks embarked on a mission to reclaim and reformulate. They began to ask, what if we honor the form and the memory of fry bread, but change its substance? You see a young Navajo chef in a restaurant kitchen, not on the res, but in Santa Fe or Phoenix. He's experimenting. He's making fry bread but using a blend of blue cornmeal and whole wheat flour, connecting it back to pre-bosque redondo ingredients. He's baking it in a hot oven brushed with a little oil instead of deep frying it, creating a texture that's familiar but lighter. He might top it with a salad of foraged purslane and roasted squash, invoking the ancient Three Sisters. This isn't about erasing fry bread, it's about having a conversation with it, about healing its narrative and its nutritional profile in one stroke. These innovators weren't discarding their history, they were writing a new, healthier chapter for it, asserting sovereignty over their own bodies and their own cuisine. This era also saw the rise of a powerful counter-narrative, expressed through art and essay. Native writers and artists began to directly confront the fry bread paradox in their work. A poem might describe the smell of it cooking as the smell of both love and loss. A painting might show a perfect piece of fry bread on a plate, with the shadow it casts forming the shape of a prison bar or a broken treaty. These creators refused to let the dialogue be dominated by either simplistic celebration or medical condemnation. They insisted on holding the full, difficult truth. That something can be nourishing to the soul and damaging to the body. That a symbol of survival can also be a vector of disease. Historians and cultural critics still argue whether these artistic and culinary reinterpretations represent the necessary evolution of a cultural practice or a form of respectability politics, an internalization of outside pressures to conform to a healthier mainstream standard. Is changing the recipe a betrayal, or is it the ultimate act of sovereignty, taking control of the narrative once more? So, as you stand between the health clinic poster and the innovative chef's kitchen, you feel the full weight of this modern reckoning. The recipe, in its physical form, remained stubbornly unchanged in millions of homes. But the space around it, the conversations, the criticisms, the creative responses, had become a battleground for the future of native health and identity. Fry bread was no longer just food, it was a question. And the community was grappling with the answer, not with one voice, but with many, a chorus of love, worry, memory, and change that sizzled as fiercely as the dough in the oil. The turn of the millennium doesn't simplify the story, it amplifies it, projecting it onto screens both big and small. The digital age arrives, and with it, fry bread achieves a new kind of celebrity, a viral, often misunderstood, fame. It's no longer just eaten at powwows or debated in community halls. It's featured on food travel shows, celebrated in online articles titled 10 Must-Try Native American Foods, and turned into memes. You're scrolling through social media now, and there it is, a perfectly framed, glossy photo of a Navajo taco, #native food #frybread love #indigenous cuisine. The image is beautiful, seductive. It is also dangerously decontextualized. For the average viewer, it's just another delicious-looking ethnic food, its history flattened into a quaint culinary curiosity. This mainstream discovery by foodies and television producers created a strange duality. On one hand, it was a point of pride. Seeing a Dine chef featured on a major network, demonstrating the making of fry bread with respect, felt like validation. It pushed back against the monolithic cowboys and Indians stereotype, showing a vibrant, living culture with a rich, if complicated, food tradition. Shows like PBS's A Chef's Life or travel programs highlighting indigenous cuisine brought visibility and, occasionally, economic opportunity to native cooks. A widely accepted fact of the digital era is the power of social media to create niche communities and amplify marginalized voices. For native food enthusiasts, platforms like Instagram and YouTube became spaces to share family recipes, showcase variations from different nations, and build a virtual community around this shared food way. But on the other hand, this exposure often came with an erasure of depth. The narrative presented to a mainstream audience frequently skipped from traditional Native American bread to delicious taco, completely leaping over the 150 years of history in between. The painful origin at Bosque Redondo was an inconvenient downer for a light-hearted food segment. The contemporary health debates were too complex for a 2-minute clip. What remained was a tasty symbol, stripped of its story and its stakes. This is where a surprising, modern twist emerges. The online debate over authenticity often gets fought by non-native people. Food forums and recipe comment sections fill with arguments from well-meaning enthusiasts about the right way to make fry bread, policing the type of fat or thickness of the dough, often without any understanding of why family-to-family variation is, in fact, the most authentic trait of all. The bread becomes a cultural artifact to be collected and catalogued by outsiders, rather than a living, breathing tradition. Simultaneously, within native digital spaces, the conversation grows more sophisticated and self-aware. You find blogs and YouTube channels run by native cooks who explicitly tackle the paradox. A video might be titled "How My Grandma Makes Fry Bread" and why it's complicated. In these spaces, the recipe is shared not as a mere cooking instruction, but as a story. The cook might speak in Dine Bizarre while mixing the dough, explain the significance of the sound it makes in the oil, and then, in the next breath, discuss their own choice to make it only for special occasions due to health concerns. This represents a reclaiming of the narrative in the digital sphere. They are controlling the context, offering the full, nuanced picture on their own terms. Historians still argue whether the internet's effect on indigenous food cultures like this one is ultimately a form of cultural appropriation and dilution or a powerful tool for education, preservation, and economic empowerment. Does the viral fame of fry bread help or hinder the understanding of its true significance? And amidst the hashtags and the hot takes, the physical, unchanging recipe persists. In home kitchens from Shiprock to Minneapolis, the ritual continues, remarkably untouched by its digital doppelganger. A young mother teaching her daughter to feel for the right dough consistency isn't thinking about food trends, she's thinking about connection. The smell that fills her house is the same smell that filled her great-great-grandmother's shelter at Bosque Redondo. That sensory thread is unbroken by broadband. The internet created a glittering, noisy reflection of fry bread, but the substance of it, the flour on the hands, the heat of the oil, the shared bite, remains rooted in the physical, emotional world of family and community. It is both a trending topic and a timeless practice, existing in parallel realities that only sometimes, and often awkwardly, touch. Let's pause the forward march of years and step into a space where time feels both cyclical and concentrated, the modern-day family kitchen on the reservation. Here, far from the debates and the documentaries, the recipe exists in its purest, most potent form, not as history or symbol, but as transmitted knowledge. This is where fry bread is not discussed, it is done. You're standing in a warm, lived-in kitchen. An elder woman, her hands mapped with a lifetime of work, is clearing the table. She doesn't pull out a cookbook or a printed recipe from the internet. She reaches for a large, worn mixing bowl, its surface cloudy from decades of use. The lesson is about to begin. and it is almost entirely nonverbal. Watch her hands. She scoops flour from the bag directly into the bowl, no measuring cups. She does it by sight, by a feel developed over 60 years. She shakes a cloud of baking powder from a can into her palm, judges it, and lets it fall. A sprinkle of salt follows. This is the widely accepted, yet almost mystical, core of the tradition. The recipe is in the body, not on the page. It's a kinesthetic memory passed from one pair of hands to another. She makes a well in the center of the dry ingredients and pours in water from a battered tin cup. Her fingers begin to work, not with the aggressive kneading of bread dough, but with a gentle, folding motion, coaxing the mixture together. "You want it soft, like your earlobe," she might finally say to the granddaughter watching intently beside her, offering the only concrete measurement you'll get. The comparison isn't random, it's a tactile benchmark that connects the craft to the human body itself. This is where a surprising, intimate detail lives, the sound of the dough. As she pats a piece of it between her palms, stretching it into a disc, it makes a soft, rhythmic pat-pat-pat. It's a quiet, domestic percussion. She pokes a hole in the center with her finger, a gesture so automatic it seems instinctual. Then comes the main event. The oil in the deep, heavy pot on the stove is hot. To test it, she might flick a tiny bit of dough into it. It should sizzle immediately and dance, not sink lethargically. When the temperature is right, she lays the stretched dough into the oil. The sound is instant and dramatic, that fierce, lively da gas. It's the sound of completion, of transformation. For the next minute or two, she is utterly focused, her eyes on the color change, her wrist ready with tongs to flip it at the precise moment one side reaches a perfect, speckled golden brown. This isn't casual cooking, it's a focused performance, a dance with heat and time. The transmission happening here is about more than technique. It's about patience. It's about respecting the ingredients and the process. The granddaughter learns that if you rush the mixing, the bread will be tough. If the oil is too cool, it will be greasy. Too hot, it will burn on the outside while staying raw inside. She learns to read the bubbles in the frying dough. But she's also learning something else, her place. In this kitchen, helping her Shima, mother, or Masani, grandmother, she is being woven into a matrilineal line that stretches back to those first women at Bosque Redondo. She is learning a language of care that predates written words. Historians and anthropologists still argue whether this oral, kinesthetic transmission, in the face of written culture and digital archives, represents a fragile, endangered form of knowledge or an incredibly resilient and adaptive one that safeguards its core by remaining personal and experimental. When the first piece is done, lifted out to drain on a paper bag or a rack, it isn't served immediately to the waiting family. The grandmother will often break off a small piece, the tester. She might hand it to the granddaughter, or pop it in her own mouth. She's checking for texture, for seasoning, for the intangible rightness. Only after this silent approval does the batch continue. In this simple act lies the entire ethos. Quality and care are internal standards, judged by the maker, not by an external audience. In this kitchen, fry bread is not a political statement or a health hazard. It is, quite simply, a skill, a loving duty, and a thread of identity being passed, warm from hand to hand, in the most sacred of classrooms, home. Now, shift your perspective from the intimacy of the kitchen to the vibrant, public spectacle of the modern powwow. Here, under a large open arbor or in a community arena, the story of fry bread unfolds on a grand, communal scale. The air, thick with the scent of burning sage, grilled meat, and dust kicked up by dancing feet, also carries that unmistakable, comforting aroma of hot oil and frying dough. It's the smell of gathering itself. At a powwow, fry bread sheds its complicated layers and, for a moment, simply becomes joy, generosity, and shared abundance. You're in line at a food vendor's booth, a colorful trailer or tent operated by a family who has been doing this for generations. The operation is a well-oiled machine, a far cry from the single skillet over a campfire, yet the heart of it is identical. Watch the vendor, often a woman with her hair tied back, working at a furious, steady pace. To her right, a helper endlessly stretches discs of dough from a massive bowl of rested dough. To her left, a deep, industrial fryer bubbles continuously. She takes the stretched dough, gives it a final, expert pat, and slides it into the hot oil. 3 or 4 pieces fry at once. Her eyes constantly scan them, her hand wielding a long wire skimmer like a conductor's baton. She doesn't need a timer, the color tells her everything. With a fluid motion, she flips them, lets them finish, and then lifts them out to drain on racks, golden and glistening. The pace is relentless because the line is never-ending. This is fry bread as a public service, as a gift to the community and a crucial source of income for the family running the booth. It's a widely recognized economic fact that food vending, especially fry bread and Indian tacos, is a vital small business enterprise for many native families, providing income at powwows, rodeos, and fairs throughout the year. But look beyond the vendor. See the people holding their freshly bought fry bread. Some sprinkle it with powdered sugar or cinnamon sugar, folding it into a warm, sweet pocket. Others head to the taco fixings station to load it up with chili, cheese, lettuce, and salsa, creating a towering, messy, glorious meal. They eat standing up, talking with friends, watching the dancers. Children run by with pieces in their hands, their faces dusted with sugar. Here, fry bread is the great social equalizer. It's eaten by fancy dancers in full regalia taking a break, by elders sitting in folding chairs, by teenagers flirting near the drum groups. It requires no utensils, fosters conversation, and fuels a day-long celebration. It is, in this context, pure, unadulterated celebration food. This public celebration, however, holds a lesser-known, competitive side. At many powwows and fairs, you'll find a fry bread contest. This is where the private kitchen craft goes public for judgment. Entrants bring their most perfect, most delicious loaves, often adhering to strict, traditional rules. No added flavors, no innovative flours, just the classic 4-ingredient dough fried to perfection. The judging is serious. Texture is paramount. Is it light and fluffy inside but crisp outside? Is it greasy or dry? Is the color a perfect, even golden brown? Is the flavor subtly salty and wheaty, not bland? Winning such a contest is a point of immense family and community pride. It's a validation of a lifetime of practice, a public acknowledgement that your hands, guided by your grandmother's teachings, produce something exceptional. It turns a daily skill into an art form and a sport. And yet, even amidst this celebration, the deeper story isn't entirely forgotten. Historians and cultural observers still argue whether the powwow, a pan-tribal phenomenon that grew in the 20th century, and its associated foods like fry bread represent a beautiful, adaptive new form of native culture or a homogenizing force that overshadows more ancient, tribe-specific traditions. Does the shared love of fry bread at a powwow create a powerful, pan-Indian solidarity? Or does it inadvertently standardize and simplify diverse indigenous identities into a single, tasty stereotype? As you take a bite of that powwow taco, the flavors exploding, the savory chili, the cool lettuce, the rich, fried bread, the question hangs in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable in that moment of pure satisfaction. For the people here, it's simply the taste of togetherness, a circle of dough that, for today, contains only the present moment's joy. Our journey takes a necessary detour now, away from the Navajo Nation itself, to see how this food of specific, painful origin became a shared symbol across vast cultural distances. Fry bread, you'll find, is not exclusive to the dine. Its story echoes, with variations, across the map of Native America. To understand its unchanging recipe is to understand the shared chapter of history that wrote it, the era of federal rationing and forced dependency. So, let's travel. You're at a Lakota powwow on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. The air is different, the language is different, the regalia is different. But walking past the food vendors, you hear the same sizzle, smell the same comforting aroma. You see fry bread, or wagmisa in Lakota. It's often made a little thicker, a little denser, sometimes even shaped into smaller balls known as fry bread bites. The story here, while unique in its details, rhymes with the Navajo one. Following the brutal suppression of the Plains tribes and the near extermination of the buffalo, the U.S. government confined people to reservations and issued rations of flour, lard, sugar, and coffee, the same survival kit. Now, hop to the desert southwest, to a Hopi village perched on a mesa. Their version might be called peaky bread, but you'll also find a fried bread made from similar ingredients. Their relationship with it is complex, as the Hopi have a deep, uninterrupted agricultural tradition of blue corn. The fried bread made from white flour is a more recent, and for some, a less prestigious addition, another marker of the intrusive outside world. Yet, it's still made, especially for large gatherings where its filling nature is practical. The point is, the ingredient list is a ghost that haunts countless reservations, a common denominator of a shared colonial experience. A widely accepted historical fact is that the U.S. government's civilization regulations and ration policies in the late 19th century were applied broadly, aiming to replace diverse, land-based hunting and agricultural economies with a standardized dependence on Euro-American goods and farming. Fry bread is the edible residue of that policy. This brings us to a surprising and poignant detail. The subtle, regional variations that emerged are like culinary dialects. In the Pacific Northwest, some tribes might use salmon oil or oa-lichen grease for frying when available, connecting the new technique to ancient fat sources. In the Southeast, where the Trail of Teys forced displacement of tribes like the Cherokee, a similar fried bread tradition emerged, sometimes sweetened and called fried dough. These variations are not deviations from a Navajo original. They are parallel inventions, each community making do with the bleakly uniform rations in their own way, sometimes blending them with remnants of their pre-removal foodways. The unchanging recipe is, in a macro sense, the list of government-issued commodities. But the micro-execution, the thickness, the shape, the preferred fat, the name, became a badge of localized identity within a shared hardship. This pan-tribal presence has fueled a modern, internal debate about authenticity and ownership. At intertribal gatherings, you might hear good-natured but serious debates. Our fry bread is better because we use milk instead of water, or ours is lighter because we let the dough rest longer. These aren't just culinary boasts. They are assertions of specific experience and pride. The Navajo can rightly claim a well-documented origin point at Bosque Redondo. The Lakota can point to their own history of starvation and rationing at Wounded Knee and beyond. This creates a fascinating dynamic where fry bread is both a unifying symbol of shared colonial history and a point of differentiation. Historians and ethnobotanists still argue whether the near-ubiquity of fry bread across many tribes should be seen as the most successful, albeit tragic, culinary imposition of the U.S. government, or as a testament to the incredible, convergent ingenuity of disparate peoples faced with the same existential threat. Was it a recipe for cultural erasure, or a recipe for survival that different cultures then made their own? As you move from one nation's gathering to another, tasting the subtly different textures, you are tasting a map of resilience. The golden circle is a common coin, but each community mints it with the slight, distinctive stamp of their own hands, their own landscape, their own memory of loss and adaptation. The unchanging core speaks to a shared past. The tiny variations whisper of unique, enduring identities that refuse to be completely erased, even by a common recipe for survival. We've followed the bread from survival to symbol, from kitchen to contest. Now, let's consider its future, and the hands that will shape it, the chefs. A new generation of native culinary artists, trained in prestigious cooking schools and working in fine dining restaurants from Phoenix to New York, is looking at fry bread with a critical, creative, and deeply respectful eye. They are not rejecting it. They are engaging with it as intellectuals and artisans, deconstructing its history to reconstruct its possibilities. You're in a sleek, modern restaurant that proudly lists its indigenous inspiration. The chef, a young Dine woman, is plating a dish that would be unrecognizable to her ancestors, yet is deeply conversant with their story. On the plate, you don't see a full, puffy circle of fry bread. Instead, you see a delicate, crispy tuile, a translucent, lacy cracker made from the same basic dough: flour, salt, baking powder, water, but rolled paper thin and fried until it shatters. It's garnished not with chili and cheese, but with a smear of heirloom bean puree, a drizzle of juniper syrup, and a dusting of powdered, smoked trout. This is fry bread reimagined as haute cuisine, its essence distilled and elevated. The chef isn't just making food, she's making a statement about evolution, about taking a food of poverty and presenting it with the sophistication it was always denied. This movement is a widely recognized trend in contemporary native cuisine, often termed indigenous food sovereignty in action, which seeks to reclaim pre-colonial ingredients and techniques while thoughtfully engaging with the realities of post-colonial foodways. These chefs are often archaeologists of flavor as much as they are cooks. They research pre-contact foods, amaranth, sumac, wild game, ancient varieties of corn and squash, and ask how they can dialogue with the ubiquitous fry bread. The result might be a deconstructed Navajo taco where the components are presented separately as an artful tasting, a miniature, perfect fry bread, a rich venison chili, a relish of foraged greens. The story of survival is told through technique and presentation, inviting the diner to contemplate each element. This approach directly tackles the health paradox, not by elimination, but by transformation and balance, pairing the rich, fried element with vibrant, nutrient-dense native foods. Here lies a surprising and hopeful detail from this culinary vanguard. Their work is creating new markets for native producers. A chef's demand for blue cornmeal, dried challah buds, or Navajo churro lamb encourages local farmers and foragers to revive these traditional practices, building a circular economy that benefits the community. The fry bread, in its refined form, becomes a bridge, introducing diners to a whole ecosystem of indigenous ingredients they never knew existed. It's a way of using the bread's fame as a gateway to a deeper, broader culinary heritage. Yet, this fine dining interpretation is not without its own controversies. Historians and cultural critics still argue whether this elevation of fry bread represents a genuine decolonization of the palate or merely its gentrification and commodification for a wealthy, largely non-native audience. Does serving a $28 artisan fry bread plate in a white tablecloth restaurant honor the grandmothers who made it to stave off starvation, or does it aestheticize and profit from their struggle? Is it a celebration or an appropriation of the community's own symbol? The chefs themselves grapple with these questions, often stating that their mission is to force the wider world to see native food, and by extension, native people, as contemporary, innovative, and worthy of the highest culinary respect. They are writing the next chapter of the recipe, not in flour and water, but in concept and critique. As you look at that delicate, shattered tuile on the fine china, you see the full arc of the story. It contains the memory of the government flour, the skill of the grandmother's hands, the communal joy of the powwow, and the critical mind of a new generation. The recipe's ingredients haven't changed, but its grammar has. It is no longer just a sentence of survival. It has become a paragraph of reflection, an essay on identity, and a question about the future, all served on a single, crisp, golden plate. But what of the original, unadorned circle? The one that emerges from a home skillet, not a chef's pass? Its power lies not in innovation, but in constancy, in its role as an edible archive. Every time the dough is mixed, every time it sizzles in the oil, it is an active memory. Not a memory of an idyllic, pre-colonial past, but a memory of survival itself. You're in a kitchen again, but now you're asked to consider the bread not as food, but as a historical document. Its very simplicity is its testimony. The short ingredient list, flour, salt, baking powder, water, fat, is a direct ledger of the US government's ration system. There is nothing extra, nothing from the old world of the Three Sisters, because in Bosque Redondo, there was nothing extra. The recipe is a fossil of that moment. This makes fry bread what scholars term a food of the diaspora, even though the Navajo remained on their continent. Their spiritual and physical landscape was shattered. They were displaced from their foodways as completely as any group forced across an ocean. The bread became a taste of the new homeland, a homeland defined by confinement and scarcity. In this way, its unchanging nature is crucial. To alter the core recipe would be to blow the record, to soften the hard edges of that history. When a grandmother makes it today exactly as her grandmother was forced to make it, she is performing a kind of involuntary remembrance. She is connecting her hands to a chain of hands that stretches back to a specific, traumatic point in time. A widely accepted historical understanding is that foodways are among the most resilient aspects of culture, often persisting long after language, dress, and other customs have been altered. Fry bread is a potent example of this, but with a twist. It is the preservation of an adaptive practice born from cultural rupture, not the preservation of an ancient one. This leads us to a lesser-known, philosophical layer, the concept of soul food in the Navajo context. For many African Americans, soul food, dishes like collard greens, black-eyed peas, and fried chicken, originated in the scraps and ingenuity of slavery and sharecropping, transforming oppression into nourishment and community. Fry bread occupies a strikingly similar emotional and historical space. It is comfort food with a painful birthright. It is food that says, we made something from nothing. We took what was meant to break us and turned it into a reason to gather. The love poured into it by generations of matriarchs is a love that actively resists the erasure of that history. To eat it with knowledge is to ingest that narrative of resilience. Yet, this role as an edible monument creates a profound tension. How do you honor a monument that is also, in a practical sense, a potential health risk? This is where the community's relationship with the bread becomes deeply personal and varied. For some, making it only on solemn occasions, like the anniversaries of the Long Walk, treats it as a sacred, ritual food of remembrance, consumed with intention and in moderation. For others, its daily or weekly presence is a defiant, normalizing act, a refusal to let trauma define their enjoyment of something that simply tastes like home and family. Historians still argue whether the best way to respect this edible history is to preserve its form religiously, even at a cost, or to actively transform it for future generations, seeing change not as disrespect, but as the continuation of the adaptive spirit that created it in the first place. So, as you watch that golden disc being lifted from the oil, see it for what it is, a circle with a hole in the center. The bread is the enduring ring of community and continuity. The hole is the void left by what was lost, the land, the old ways, the ancestors who didn't survive. Together, they form a single entity, a record of absence and presence, of loss and creation, fried into a form that is, for better and worse, permanently, unchangeably Navajo. It is a recipe that remembers, even when those who follow it are simply thinking about dinner. Our narrative, having spanned generations, now tightens its focus to a single, universal moment: the passing of the recipe. This is not the grand transmission of a powwow chef or the intellectual interpretation of a restaurateur. This is the quiet, fragile, human moment where everything, history, identity, love, is condensed into the act of showing someone how to feel for the right texture. You are in that kitchen again, but the perspective has shifted. You are no longer just an observer, you are the granddaughter. Your Masani, your grandmother, has decided today is the day. She doesn't announce it as a lesson. She simply says, "Come here. Help me." Your hands are new to this. You overpour the water, making the dough sticky. She sprinkles in a little more flour, her movements economical. "Like this," she murmurs, taking your hands in hers. Her skin is warm, papery, traced with veins like a map of her life. She guides your fingers through the folding motion. This is kinesthetic learning at its most profound, history flowing from her nerves to yours. You are not just learning to make bread, you are learning her touch, her rhythm, her patience. The bowl between you is a conduit. A widely recognized truth in cultural anthropology is that the most vital traditions are often sustained not through formal education, but through this intimate, embodied apprenticeship, where values are transmitted alongside skills. In this moment, you are learning respect for ingredients, care in process, and the quiet pride of making something with your own hands. As you struggle to pat the dough into a round disc, yours comes out lopsided, thicker on one edge. She doesn't criticize. She might smile a little, a flash of memory in her eyes. "My first one looked like a turtle," she might say, and in that simple, forgiving joke, the pressure evaporates. She shows you how to fix it, gently pulling and patting. The lesson is about imperfection being part of the process. The hole you poke in the center feels like a significant act, a ritual stamp. Then comes the test of the oil. You're nervous. She stands beside you, a calm presence. "Now," she says. You lay the dough in the oil. It sizzles violently, and you jump back a little. The sound, "da diniel gas," is now yours. You've triggered it. You watch, mesmerized, as the bubbles form and the pale dough begins its alchemical turn to gold. She instructs you when to flip it, her voice steady. When you lift it out, drained and finished, it's not perfect. It's a little dark on one side. But it's yours. This is where a surprising, emotional alchemy occurs. That first, imperfect piece is never served to the family. It is the cook's bread, the learner's trophy. She will have you break it and share it with her right there by the stove. As you taste your own work, the flavor is familiar, yet completely new. It tastes of effort, of focus, of connection. In that bite, the abstract cultural tradition becomes personal, sensory, and yours. You have entered the chain. The recipe is no longer a story you hear. It is a skill you hold in your hands. You have, in a small way, become a keeper of the archive. And yet, this beautiful moment is shadowed by the unspoken complexities of the modern world. As you stand there with her, you are likely aware of the health debates. You may have studied the history of Bosque Redondo in school. This knowledge lives alongside the simple love for your grandmother. Historians and educators still argue whether the full, difficult history of foods like fry bread should be explicitly taught alongside the culinary technique, or if doing so risks burdening a personal, familial ritual with a weight that can crush its joy. Is the legacy best carried by mindful, informed A's? or by practitioners who focus purely on the craft and love, leaving the analysis to others? In your grandmother's kitchen, the question is irrelevant. For her, the lesson is about continuity, about ensuring you can feed yourself and your family, about giving you a piece of home you can carry anywhere. The history is in her hands, and now, it is in yours. The recipe, in this moment of transmission, transcends all debate. It is simply a gift, passed from one generation to the next, warm, tangible, and alive. The story of Frybread is a circle with no true end, only a continuous, simmering present. It cannot be concluded, only contemplated from the center of its own contradictions. It is, and will remain, all these things at once, a food of oppression and a food of resilience, a symbol of loss and a symbol of community, a health concern and a comfort, a relic of history and a living, breathing practice. Its unchanging recipe is the anchor around which a swirling sea of meaning crashes. To understand it is to hold two opposing truths in your mind, and in your hands, without needing one to cancel out the other. Tonight, we followed its scent from the barren flats of Bosque Redondo to the bustling powwow grounds, from the lonely urban apartment to the innovative chef's kitchen, from the grandmother's worn bowl to the granddaughter's tentative fingers. We've seen it serve as political statement, economic engine, artistic medium, and edible heirloom. Its journey mirrors the journey of the dying people themselves, shaped by external forces, scarred by tragedy, yet insistently adapting, enduring, and defining themselves on their own terms. The bread did not create their identity, but it became a vessel for expressing its modern, complex contees. A widely accepted view is that cultural identity is not static, but is constantly being negotiated and redefined through practices like food. Frybread is a masterclass in that negotiation. And so, as our journey together winds down, let the final image be a simple one. Not the first piece fried in desperation, nor the perfect one winning a ribbon, but a piece on an everyday plate, in an everyday home. It is there, alongside stew or beans, or simply with a cup of coffee. It is unremarked upon, because it is expected. It is normal. This, perhaps, is its ultimate triumph. After everything, the forced marches, the failed policies, the debates, the criticisms, it has achieved the quiet, profound status of normalcy. It is a part of life. For a people whose existence has so often been seen as a relic or a problem, having something as simple as their daily bread be simply theirs, without fanfare or explanation, is a quiet victory. The wind down begins now, the pace slowing, the details softening like the edges of a well-worn story told at bedtime. The hiss of the oil fades to a gentle whisper, the flour dust settles like snow in the lamplight, the golden brown color warms to the hue of a setting sun on a mesa. The hands that mix, stretch, and fry become gentle, rhythmic shadows against a kitchen wall. The debates of historians, the concerns of doctors, the accolades of chefs, they all recede into a distant murmur, like far-off traffic. What remains is the circle. A simple, nourishing circle. It holds within its crisp exterior and soft interior a universe of memory and meaning. But for tonight, let it just be bread. Let the story it tells be one of hands caring for hands, of knowledge passed like a secret in the dark, of a people who, against all odds, made a way where there was none, and in doing so, created a taste that would forever say home, however complicated that home may be. The fire is banked. The skillet is cool. The story is told, but the making continues, tomorrow and tomorrow, in 1,000 kitchens, a testament to an unchanging recipe that, against every expectation, meant not an end, but a beginning.